relative ease, so that it can be scaled quite easily, as opposed to bringing every single student down to the lab. So, we think about simulation often as traditional standardized patients in a clinical space or mannequin-based simulations for resuscitations. But there are online simulation platforms that we sometimes forget to leverage and to build to scale. And that's what these two projects did. The second one that I referenced, Danielle Miller's paper, has just been accepted by BMC Medical Education and will be out in 2022. So it'll be Miller et al.
I think it's interesting because you're right. That EPA is very difficult to do with students and it's especially something that I would say you must use simulation for in some way because of the experience students are going to have. They're certainly not going to have the opportunity to initiate evaluation and management of someone in an urgent or emergent situation. Well, there are 13 EPAs, and like we said before, it's not easy to create curricula around them, especially in simulation. It takes a lot of work. I always think about EPA 11 and 12, about getting informed consent and performing general procedures as some of the easiest EPAs to use simulation for. But there are other EPAs that might be more difficult, like interprofessional collaboration, which is EPA 9, or EPA 13, identifying system failures and improving culture. And I'll never forget a task force that we had at Northwestern that I was a part of to look at the EPAs that we could use simulation-based mastery learning specifically for, or just simulation in general. And I know that we've created some mastery learning around informed consent and, as you know, procedures, EPAs 11 and 12. And there's some work on EPA 8 for handovers, but not necessarily the other ones to mastery. I mean, most OSCEs work on the earlier EPAs like 1 and 2. Kind of, you mentioned that as being your preclinical, and those are gathering information and performing a physical exam and getting like a problem list or differential. So it's very interesting on how this can be done, but I almost wish that there was a consensus statement by the AAMC to say, this is how you do it, or this is how we recommend you do it, rather than leaving it up to all the individual programs.
It's not the behavior of these accreditation organizations to do that, though, right? If you look at the ACGME, first the general competencies, the outcomes, and now, the milestones, there are requirements, right, of things to assess. And with the milestones, there are some suggestions on how to do that, how to gather multi-source data and where those sources might come from. But there's certainly nothing that's prescriptive, like you're talking about. And I think that's probably okay. There's lots of different types of medical schools and lots of different types of clinical environments for some medical schools now that have distant sites from their main hospitals and rural rotations where you probably can't guarantee that there's going to be the tech needed to be able to do things uniformly. But so there's probably some value in leaving it a bit loose. But by leaving it loose, it leaves to interpretation a lot of the minimum passing standards, if you will, for these schools. And I think the way that Northwestern assesses EPA 10 is probably very different than the way we assess EPA 10, which is probably very different than our peer institutions. And that's, I think, that fluidity is the problem. That variation is the problem, not necessarily, in my mind, at least, not capturing the data, but, knowing to which degree that you have to capture the data. And I think we can agree that that can be difficult to do. So with respect to Cynthia Peng's project that I referenced earlier, the one that used avatars and interacted with cartoon patients online, that was specifically designed not necessarily for our emergency medicine clerkship, though it could easily be used there. It was specifically designed for graduating medical students. So they, in the transition from UME to GME, right, there's this liminal space where there's a graduate recently graduated medical student who's waiting to begin their internship a couple months later. And can that time be leveraged to be able to do some assessments? And this would primarily be for an audience of residency directors who receive classes of residents who have quite variable skills. And there's a presumption now from the EPA framework that every graduating medical student should be competent for every EPA, but we know that's just not true. So creating a platform where you can deliver to scale an assessment that's done not in a simulation center, but done online asynchronously for free, and then deliver that data to a residency director and say, well, this student actually is competent in whatever EPA or is not. And that's what Cynthia's program primarily was geared towards. It was this transition to GME space, and it was almost like confirming, wink, wink, nod, nod, that the medical students really were competent. It was shocking the numbers of students who, at least by the measures of our platform, were incompetent for several of the EPAs. And that's important knowledge for a residency director to know, that they're inheriting students who, were not adequately assessed, or the passing standard was just so divergent from what you would expect it to be, that you have interns that are perhaps behind the eight ball and need to be caught up to the rest of the class. And that could be through initial boot camps, that could be through a different clinical clerkship schedule for the interns. So there's a lot of ways to do it, but you have to know that they're going to struggle when they're coming in the door. And that's what I think some of these online simulation platforms really can be used best for.
Well, this is the ongoing argument: is what is the responsibility of the medical school? What's the responsibility of the residency program? And where is the line drawn? Because, as you know, for some of these EPAs, how far do they go? What procedures should a student know at the end of medical school? And I was fortunate to write a book chapter giving our group's opinion on that, but it's still debated at this time. EPA 1, how far does it go? Is it just a general history in physical, or is it a focus history in physical for a specific disease state that, and you can go on and on. Some of these genetic diseases, they get very specific on how you take a history for. So,
well, we're looking at this in emergency medicine to make specialty specific EPAs, right? I think that's what you're getting at. The AAMC core entrustable professional activities, the 13 of those are really meant for the graduating medical student. They're not meant to be kicked down the road to residency directors. What I think the specialties need to do are create specialty specific EPAs. That pediatrics was the first out of the gate to do this. Emergency medicine is in the midst of it. One of my colleagues, Holly Creta-Wire at Stanford, received one of the 13 AMA Reimagining Residency grants, and it's funding the development of emergency medicine specific EPAs and OPAs. And we're in year 3 of the 5-year grant cycle, where we're collecting, we had defined the EPAs and OPAs in the first 2 years, and now we're collecting data from smartphone apps that are being used to collect EPA assessment data real time in clinical units. And we're building a big data warehouse so that we're going to be able to, in year 5, to be able to compare individual emergency medicine resident performance to this database and make some predictive decisions, probably not prescriptive by year 5, but predictive analytics. And ultimately that project is going to be universally delivered to all of the emergency medicine residencies for free at the end of year 5 of the grant, so that everyone's going to be able to contribute to this database. And I'll say Northwestern is one of the 8 sites that are collecting the preliminary data for this particular project.
So for our listeners who may not be familiar, can you tell us what OPAs are?
Yeah, the observable practice activities. So these are very specific actions that a learner can demonstrate in front of you that really build towards an EPA. It may be that 10 or 12 OPAs map back to a single EPA. Let's take, for instance, an equivalent to EPA 10, which is the resuscitation one we've referenced already. A faculty member may watch a resuscitation and see numerous OPAs, a senior resident who has situational awareness in the room, who's able to use closed loop communication, who is able to rescue a procedure that's not being performed correctly by a junior resident. These are all very specific activities that all lead back to the ability to initiate treatment and resuscitate a patient. So, we need these specific markers sometimes to be able to gather multi-source data in such a way that we do true programmatic assessment, CBME style programmatic assessment. So the OPAs really help with that, and they get very granular. And you can imagine that a faculty member walking around with a smartphone app who has a list of these can just click on one of them and assess that one single OPA or EPA, and that one single data point can drive back to a warehouse. Well, you could do that numerous times on a shift. It's gone are the days of these long written evaluations where there's 10 or 12 or 20 domains that are getting evaluated. Now it's the world of smartphones and a single EPA or a single OPA, and you just remember to do it every few hours on a shift. And in emergency medicine, you can create huge databases from those data points. So that's what Dr. Creta-Wire and her team are working on. And I believe they're near 3 of 5, and we should be realizing this project within a short amount of time.
And this for me is where SIM comes in, because when you have these smartphone apps and you talk about OPAs and they haven't observed some of the components of the EPA, you realize, oh, I didn't get a chance to observe this component of the EPA. We need to bring this individual to the SIM lab to actually be able to observe it. Has anybody done any work on that you're aware of?
No, but it makes natural sense, right? I think we're going to find out from this database that we're creating with the AMA grant, both at Stanford and then at these 8 other sites. We're going to realize where the holes in the data are, right? And we're just not sure yet. I can tell you as a preview, this hasn't been published yet, but the emergency medicine EPAs total 23. So from the 23 EPAs, there's going to be branch points down to 5 to 10 OPAs per EPA, if you will. And those data points are going to be sometimes easily captured just because there's frequency of these events in an emergency department. They're maybe captured just because they're more fun to assess, right? There's certain things that are just they happen more frequently, or they are more critical in the nature of the patient complaint or the way the treatment comes down. They're just fun to airways and medical codes or trauma resuscitations. And then there's probably much more granular OPAs that have to be observed at the bedside, and they're just not observed as frequently. We don't go to the bedside and watch our learners as much as we probably should in non-resuscitation cases. So to your point, you're correct. We're going to have to find ways to backfill some of those data points that aren't being assessed as frequently, and SIM makes all the sense in the world.
Literally, the importance of having very objective ways to measure EPAs, OPAs that are reliable and that you can use, rather than what we normally use is these subjective end of the rotation evaluations that not only are going to be variable based on what the attending saw you perform, but also variable on many other reasons. And we know that they're affected by a lot of biases that are implicit, as well as other things that might affect how one does performance. So the more we can objectify these, the better off we are.
Yeah, I mean, that's the beauty of your work, Jeff, and the papers that you published initially on Central Lines, and what has grown from that as a body of knowledge. We need to have very rigorous and objective measurements. And, our group at Stanford Furman believes this mastery learning methodology as well, that we've taken from the training courses at Northwestern and have expanded at our place. And I totally agree with you. So of all the projects that we've done with mastery learning at Stanford, one does relate to you and me learners. So I thought maybe I could tell you a little bit about that. And it's our mastery learning for donning and doffing PPE. So we, when COVID first broke in March of 2020, we very quickly created a mastery learning checklist for the donning and doffing of PPE using a double glove technique in a patient care room that does not have an anteroom. So this is a very common scenario, right? Most of our clinical spaces don't have anterooms, and we assume that it was an aerosolized virus at the time, and so similar to the need to do a double glove aerosolized technique for TB patients that we use. So we created a donning and doffing mastery learning. We put through all of our residents and faculty members within 3 weeks to make sure that everybody was up to speed on how to properly use PPE at the very beginning of the pandemic. So this was within 8 weeks, we were up and running and had trained everyone. So we published that paper.